Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive Emerald City Hockey Seattle Kraken podcast. And I guess I gotta address the obvious here first. This is not going to be like a normal deep dive episode. RJ left yesterday for his honeymoon, not going to be around. There wasn't a good time for us to record the deep dive together. So today we're doing things a little bit different. I will be talking for a little bit, kind of go over the more recent news. I'll pass it off to RJ, who pre-recorded a segment yesterday on his own. And, there might be some like back and forth between the two of us with our kind of monologues. There's some short form thoughts, there's some longer form thoughts, and I might edit those together that way, just to keep the shorter stuff together and then the longer stuff. But that's how this week's deep dive is kind of going to go. You're going to hear, like I said, more of a monologue from one of us and then a monologue from the other, just kind of talking about the state of the team, state of the organization, a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about during post games or the questions that we've been answering from the community, whether on social media, Discord, or in person when we do meetups or when people bump into us, and then of course on the post game lives, just kind of talking about where the team is at and how this season has gone, how we've kind of gotten here, our thoughts on things like the front office, the coaching staff, how they've handled things, and then obviously the players there. So that's how this week's going to go. We'll see if you all like it. Hopefully you all like it. I've listened to RJ's. I know what I'm going to talk about. I still think you're going to get all of the information, the great information that we would normally give. It's just going to be a little bit different of a delivery this week while RJ is out of town and hopefully having a wonderful time celebrating his new marriage, which is very exciting. So the first things that I want to talk about are going to be shorter topics. But before I get to those, got to thank our wonderful sponsor, the law offices of Rico Tessendor. Yes, we've been talking about them for a while now, right? We have a wonderful time working with Rico. And I've noticed, this past week, got back up from being down south helping out my mom. There was snow. Like, it snowed on Wednesday. I was around for Wednesday, around for Thursday, right? And oh man, driving in snow is not something I have ever had to do before. Driving on icy roads, kind of having that slick surface, especially in a city like Seattle with all of the hills, that was new to me. And I totally understand now all of the stories and everything that I've heard, both from people up here, but also people from like back east, Midwest. My sister right now dealing with the heavy snowfall in Michigan all winter long. And driving in it is no joke, and I hope everybody is able to stay safe out there. But if there was to be an issue out on the road while the roads are maybe a little icy, while there's some snow going on out there, again, just a lot of hills, wet, slick surface on the hills, things happen, and Rico is going to be there to help you if and when they do. And while we hope none of you need his services, the odds say at some point someone out there will be involved in an accident, potentially on the road because of those icy conditions. And if you are, we hope you call Rico at 425-778-9800 or visit his website, ricotessendor.com, to schedule a free consultation. He's won millions of dollars for his clients and helped thousands of people in the greater Seattle area. And as a fellow member of the ECH community, we know he'll help you too. Let him handle it, right? You get an icy collision, auto collision. Let him handle the paperwork. That's what Rico's there for. Let him deal with the insurance company if the insurance company is going to give you a hard time about things. You know what I mean? Like, just saying, throwing that out there. All right, so moving on, the big news for the Kraken after their bit of the regular season wrapped up before the Four Nations tournament on that kind of like last day of stuff that we were seeing. Things happen, Super Bowl Sunday, that day the NHL scheduled two games to be played on, that very normal thing that the NHL should do. The Seattle Kraken did make a couple roster moves. They reassigned Cale Fleury and Alex Stezka to the Coachella Valley Firebirds, so they went ahead and sent them down. They recalled Victor Osman from the Kansas City Mavericks, which I know maybe raised some eyebrows for some people, and I'll explain what that's about in a second. And then they placed Mitchell Stevens on waivers the idea being to send Mitchell Stevens down to Coachella Valley. Now, all of these moves make sense to me. I think with everybody that was being sent back down to the Firebirds, whether it's Mitchell Stevens, Cale Fleury, or Alex Steska, it's just so that they can get reps during the Four Nations break, right? Teams got a couple weeks off. You want those guys to be able to help out the Firebirds. Firebirds are still going to be playing games. You want to get good seeding for them, looking ahead to the playoffs, all of that kind of stuff. You want those players to be playing if possible. Go ahead and give them the reps. With Victor Osman coming up from the KC Mavericks and coming all the way up to the Kraken roster, and this is what I think raised the most eyebrows for a lot of people, was like, what's going on there with the goaltending situation? Is Osman going to be the new backup to Joey? I don't think so. I'm pretty sure that what all of this was about is the Kraken need two goaltenders on the roster just to meet minimum NHL roster requirements. Okay, so the minimum roster requirements for an NHL roster is 18 skaters and two goaltenders. And by sending Stezka back down to Coachella Valley, that meant only Joey was going to be on the roster. I believe they pulled Victor Osman up from the Mavericks just so that they can meet the minimum roster requirements at the NHL level going into the Four Nations tournament break. And this way, you can have Stezka playing with Grubauer down at Coachella Valley. And if I had to guess, I don't know that this is the plan, but this sure seems like a plan. You have Stezka and Grubauer alternate starts down in Coachella Valley during the couple weeks that you have here for the Four Nations tournament break. And then whichever one of them is doing better, you bring them back up. I think all along the idea is that Grubauer will have found some of his groove. You can bring Grubauer back up after the Four Nations break, have him with Joey down the stretch for the rest of the season. But hey, maybe Stezka just totally blows you away. Maybe he plays really good. Don't know, but I think the idea is to kind of have that competition between Stezka and Grubauer down with the Firebirds, and then whichever one of them plays better, you go ahead and bring them back up. Because looking ahead to when the Kraken come back, I believe the Kraken have a back-to-back coming out of the break, if I'm not mistaken. Let me like double check that now, real quick. But if that's the case, you're going to need that second goaltender. You're going to need somebody there, and I think that doing it this way just makes the most sense. I don't think Victor Osman is going to be handling a start for you. You know what I mean? Like I don't think that that's the idea behind this. I just think it's because they literally had to. There is no back to yes, there is a back to back. You got Florida on the 22nd and Tampa on the 23rd, both on the road. So you do need to have a goaltender up for that. Like I said, I don't think it'll be Victor Osman. I think you let those other two guys battle it out at the AHL level, Stezka and Grubauer, and you bring up whoever it is. And then we'll also see which players the Kraken decide to bring back as well after that Four Nations tournament. If maybe Jordan Eberle's ready to go and you can pull him off of IR and add him back to the roster. There's going to be some options for them. Right now, they are running lean with that 18-man roster. Like that is where they're at right now. There's not a ton of wiggle room. And if Jordan Eberle was to come back off of IR or LTIR, obviously the cap situation becomes something difficult for the Kraken again, just like it was at the beginning of the year. But I feel like that's a bridge that Ron's going to cross when the time is to cross it. But that's kind of my thoughts on the moves that were made yesterday on Super Bowl Sunday that the Kraken made, why I think those moves happened, why I think they all kind of make sense, and that there's, something to talk about with all of that there. I think what I'm going to do now is pass things off to RJ, let RJ talk about some of his more short form topics, talks about a couple of players and some of the ideas around a couple players on the Kraken roster. Going to let him talk about those, and then I think I'll come back for my long form, and then we'll move into RJ's long form discussion on the front office after that.
Hey everyone. Hope you all enjoyed whatever it was Dylan just said. It's kind of weird not having him here. You know what? Different format for this deep dive podcast. We'll see how it turns out. Dylan told me he would have already explained to you everything about how this is going to work. So yeah, we'll give this a go. I mean, look, I'll be honest. For the last few days, my mind has kind of been elsewhere with my honeymoon trip in yeah, a few hours from now. I'm heading out to the airport, so I'll just give a few kind of short form thoughts on some Kraken players right now and some stuff that's going on right now, and then I'm going to attempt a more long form thought about why I think the Kraken shouldn't bring back Ron Francis next year, and kind of starting to make that case that I will make a little bit more as the season goes on. And when we kind of get to the decision making part of this off season, I just kind of want to lay out some of the groundwork for it, because I'm already starting to see some of the talk about that. And I know on the post game last night, there were questions about like, wow, I didn't realize RJ, you were kind of fully in the get rid of Ron Francis camp. And so I'll kind of try and explain a little bit further why that's the case. So looking back at my notes here, I mean, I think there's still a lot of detail that's probably going to be left out, just given how my schedule's been. So bear with me. I don't know if I'm going to do the best job, but these are just kind of the conclusions that I've come to while lying awake at night after many a home game recently. So let's get started on the short form thoughts. And the first one, got to start with Shane Wright's ice time, because I've just been thinking about this a lot, really, in the short term and leading up into the Four Nations break. Um, First of all, I love how he's been playing. Like, he's for real. He's good. I think Shane Wright can definitely be a 60 to 70 point player in the NHL, and he's showing that with the way that he's playing right now. But as I've said many times before, the Kraken need to play him more. I know the reason is that they've been kind of sheltering him to try and keep him confident. And to an extent, I get that. Like, yeah, don't put him against Connor McDavid, Nathan McKinnon. That's okay. Keep his confidence high. But especially recently against teams like, say, the Ducks, where he played 12 minutes, give him 18 plus minutes a night. Like, there's nobody there that you could possibly be sheltering him from, where he's going to need that. So I really hope they take the training wheels off when the Four Nations break ends. And it was cool to see John Forsland agree with that. I think he made some really good points on Kraken Weekly with Mike Benton this past week. He referenced Eric Stahl and kind of talked about the comparison there with Eric Stahl's development in his rookie season. And I know different situations, Stahl 19 and Shane Wright already 21, but Eric Stahl in his rookie year, I think he finished with 31 points that year. But Forsland talked about how, and of course, he was there in Carolina when that was all happening. They made a coaching change. I think they got rid of Paul Maurice and they brought in Peter Laviolette mid-season. And when they made that coaching change, they gave Eric Stahl a bunch more ice time. And so I looked at his game log from that year, and you see for a little while he's got he's got 13 14 minutes, 8 minutes, stuff like that. And when the coaching change happens, 18 19, even played 29 minutes one of these games. And I think Forsland kind of credited that extra ice time and that extra opportunity for that jump. That, of course, you had the lockout in between, so we did play in the AHL that next year, but that jump from 31 points to 100 points the next season. And so I think he made some really good points there. And look, he said it's not always going to be pretty. It's not, he's going to make mistakes, but that's okay. And that's how a young player learns. And so I'm really serious about this. And I know I'm not the only one who thinks this. As soon as the Kraken come back, Shane Wright needs to be playing like a top six player. If you don't get those growing pains out of the way now, you'll be experiencing them next year when the results really start to matter again too. And that's something I'm worried about with him, because whenever he does make that jump to play against top competition and kind of have more of that top six role, he's going to make some mistakes. Like, it's just going to happen because he's a young player, and that's fine. But you know what? If you can get them out of the way now when the wins and losses don't matter, you're not going to have to deal with it. And that's my worry, is next year, if they do wait, if they do keep sheltering him the rest of this year, next year they kind of give him that jump. And I'm worried that whoever's the coach next year, whether it's Dan or somebody else, might see those mistakes and might not play him enough, because then all of a sudden the wins and losses matter again. Like, they're going to be feeling the pressure, whether it's Dan, keeping his job for next year. There's going to be a lot of pressure on him to keep that job, or whether it's a new coach in his first season with the Kraken, there's going to be pressure for wins and losses. And so I'd rather just get those moments out for Shane Wright while there isn't that kind of pressure. So I'm going to stay on them with this when they come back for the Four Nations break. Second thought, and it's another one that I've kind of mentioned before, but I think it just was worth mentioning again. I'm worried they're going to burn out Joey. Joey Decord, really heavy workload going to the Four Nations break. And I'm worried that not just in the short term, because look, he's clearly fine. He made it to the break. He's okay. He's not injured. But for something like this with goaltending, the effects don't show up right away. And I'm talking about long-term effects too. Like, the human body is not meant to play butterfly goalie. And I think all this wear and tear, it does add up over the course, not just of a season, but of a career. And I worry about that for him, given that he's with a long-term contract for the Kraken. And so I just hope they kind of lighten his workload going forward. And also, just look, I know Joey goalie, he'll tell you, like, he loves to play games. He doesn't mind it. And because we got that question, I think on Twitter last night, is like, is Joey have a problem with this? No, he definitely doesn't. But I think goalies often don't know what's best for themselves. And so that's why you need coaches to come in there and make that call. I think if it was up to the goalies, they tell you they should play just about every game. But we know that's not good for the body. So just mentioning that one more time. Another one from mentioned a little bit on the post game last night, but yeah, I'm kind of at the point where I think Ty Karche is probably not an everyday NHL player, and I kind of want somebody else to take that spot. I think Ryan Winterton should have the chance to do that basically now after the Four Nations break. I'd love to see Ryan Winterton kind of go and compete and try and take that fourth line spot, and then try and parlay that into the next season. And as you look at Karche, his contract's up. He's an RFA. Qualifying offer would be a little over $800,000. That's more than league minimum, not that much more than league minimum. So like, I wouldn't mind qualifying him. He does have arb rights, but I don't think he can really make much of a case in arbitration. But honestly, I'm kind of at the point where just, take it or leave it from him. I wouldn't mind seeing a prospect get a shot there, just given the lack of production. I think maybe Ryan Winterton could do better in that spot. And then the final thing of just like the short form points is, I think we need to manage our expectations on Capo Caco just a little bit, because I'll start by saying I love what he's doing. I love the way he's playing. Like, he's done everything you could have asked and more since arriving in Seattle. I love that they have a power forward. He just brings something that this team doesn't have. And so I don't want this misconstrued in any way is that I don't like Capo Caco or the way that he's playing. Absolutely love it. So I wanted to start off by saying that. But I think when we start talking about Kako as maybe a franchise centerpiece, or he was mentioned along the likes of, like Maddie and Shane as kind of a running mate as far as the franchise cornerstone, or saying things like, let's rush to sign him right now. Go 6 years times 5.5 and just lock that down, and it'll be a great deal. I think we have to pump the brakes just a little bit and be clear about what we can reasonably expect production wise, because we've seen players have a really good month or so of hockey before, and it's not necessarily indicative of what they are long term. And again, I like what Capo Caco projects to be long term. I really like what he's doing. But I think we have to be a little bit careful, just because I want to compare it to his fellow Finn, Eli Tolvanen, when Tolvanen arrived with the Kraken, and the production is pretty similar. Like, Eli Tolvanen is, within a couple points through the first 24 games of where Capo Caco was. Tolvanen had 15 points in his first 24 games. Caco with 17 points in 24 games, and Tolvanen had 10 goals to Caco's 5. So they are playing a little bit different in terms of the game. But just when we talk about, production and where Caco ultimately, it ends up, I think we have to remember that, like, the change of scenery was very good for him, but I don't know that we can count on that, like, 17 points in 24 games pace that he's got. And so I think definitely re-sign him, definitely bring him back, look into long-term. I think you should look into it, but consider a bridge deal to mitigate risk, because I'm still at the point where I want to see more of a sample size. And you know what? If you sign that bridge deal and he hits on it and he is a star and you do end up having to pay him big money in a couple years, I think you'll take it. Like I think that's a risk where you really don't mind. I mean, it's the same thing like with Vince Dunn a couple years ago when it was his time to get a contract extension. Ron Francis goes with a shorter term deal instead of kind of going max term and mitigate some risk. And like, yeah, Vince Dunn turned out to be worth it. Like if you could go back, yeah, I bet you'd rather would have rather signed him to an 8-year deal just because of how well it'll age. But given the risk involved, I think you'll take the best case scenario that he is an impact defenseman. So I would kind of treat it the same way with Capo Caco, and I bet he wouldn't mind kind of signing a shorter term bridge deal as well.
All right. Thanks, RJ, for that. And I do, look, I agree. Shane Wright ice time stuff, like we've been talking about, like this stuff's got to happen here soon. You know what I mean? And I'm going to kind of end on talking about maybe some of the younger players, how bright the future is, kind of then leading into RJ's next topic, which is talking about the front office. But I want to talk about the coaching staff. I feel like this is kind of a good breakdown between my strong suits and RJ's strong suits, him being the armchair GM, me being more of the X's and O's kind of guy. And we've been getting more and more questions kind of around the coaching staff, around the way the team has been playing. And I had a lot of thoughts the other night after that game against the Toronto Maple Leafs on post game that I kind of shared. And I want to reiterate some of those, maybe explain them in a more succinct way, just kind of talk through my thoughts on the coaching staff and kind of where we're at with the coaching staff. And I want to start by saying, first and foremost, I really like this coaching staff. Like, I am a big fan of this coaching staff. I think this is a coaching staff that does a lot of things well. I think they're a coaching staff that really understands how to develop players and also how the NHL is played right now and what things are successful at the NHL level right now. And I think that that's really important. That's something that I think you want out of your coaching staff. I understand that that might sound odd given the results and the way things have looked on the ice, but that's what we're here to talk about, is kind of why I think the coaching staff has been good or is good, but also why the team has performed the way they have under this coaching staff, and kind of how those two things can maybe coexist a little bit. I will start by saying this, and I'll maybe start negative and then work a little positive if that's all right with everybody. I will say this: there are a couple issues with this coaching staff that I've talked about over the last several weeks that I do think need to be addressed. They're maybe starting to be addressed. Things are maybe starting to change, but the big issues that I've kind of identified with this coaching staff are things like the slow start problem. And it's not that I necessarily think this is all on the coaching staff, that the team has struggled to start games so consistently over the course of the year. It's the fact that it's continued to be an issue all throughout the course of the season, right? You are 57 games into the season, and the fact that we're still starting off post games or asking Dan in media scrums about the slow start and do you like the start? What can be done different? Where do we go from here? Right? That's an issue. Like, nothing should stay that kind of prevalent throughout the season when it's, seemingly an addressable issue. Okay. And I don't know if it is a breakdown in communication from coaching staff to players, if the coaching staff has identified what they believe is the issue with everybody starting games slowly and then just has not been able to effectively communicate that or effectively kind of change what the players are doing to then get better starts out of them, or if it is just a player ability problem and these players just have a mental block, whatever it is, with starting games on time and being able to play consistent beyond maybe a quick 5 minute start, or things look good and then you hit the first TV timeout 9 minutes into the period and then things kind of fall apart for them. But I think the fact that all of us can probably count, maybe not on one hand, but on two hands, the amount of like good, solid first period or full game efforts from this team, when we could count, using our hands, toes, and then somebody else's hands, the amount of games where this team has started slow. Like I said, this far into the season, it feels like that should be something that has been addressed, or at least attacked maybe more than it seems to have been from the outside, just as an issue it's something that needs to be dealt with. It hasn't really been dealt with because it is still here and it shouldn't really still be here. So that's kind of my first issue, is just the fact that that issue has kind of gone on as long as it has. It's impacted this team's ability to win games. I think this team, it has enough talent to be a playoff team. It has enough talent to be a team that is pushing for a playoff spot. Even if they're not going to be in a playoff spot, they should be like kind of in Calgary's spot or St. Louis's spot, right? They should be a lot closer than they are. You've got a top payroll. You should be up there, kind of thing, right? And I do think that that slow start problem has cost them a lot of games in the standings. It's cost them a lot of points in the standings, whether it's wins or just getting to overtime, something the team has done better about since last week's deep dive when I brought up the issue. So I'll give them credit for that. But that has been a big issue with this team, that I don't feel like the coaching staff has either answered in a good way about or addressed. The other thing that I've had an issue with the coaching staff is, and this is where we get into that territory of, I really like the ideas the coaching staff is bringing, but I think maybe in practice it's not working. And that is with the systems that they're utilizing. And I've said this so many times, so I'll just go through it kind of quickly. Zone defense. That's what all the top teams are running. That is the best defensive structure you can play in the NHL right now. I very firmly believe that. Kind of going with that 2-3 zone. I absolutely love it. This team tried to do that. That is what the coaching staff, installed during training camp, was a 2-3 zone. It has not worked at all this season, right? Like, there has been massive defensive problems for this group basically since the beginning. They just were never really able to build that foundation, never really able to get it going for one reason or another. I think from watching as much of this team as I have, watching all 57 games, I think a lot of it is because that zone defense requires forward buy-in. It requires your forwards to come down in the zone and really help out your defensemen. And I feel like that's kind of maybe where the block is. I think there's been some struggles from the defensemen for sure. I think on the physical side of things, that is a problem. They don't body guys up. They don't really, try to take away somebody's space using their bodies, using their size, using their physicality. That's not how really anybody on this defense tends to play. And I think that that is an issue for them. But I also think that the forwards have not been coming down low enough into the defensive zone to really help out. I don't think that, weak side wingers really know how to be covering the slot to the degree that they have to run this system and to have it run as well as the good teams have it run. So I think that that's been an issue. I also think with the kind of 200-foot, we're going to be a skating team, to borrow Dan's words. We're going to be a team that gets up the ice quickly and attacks in transition. Love it. That's what all the top teams do. Watch last year's Stanley Cup final. That's what Florida and Edmonton are doing. That's what the Dallas Stars do, a team that was in the Final Four, right? It's what the New York Rangers do. That is what good teams do. The Carolina Hurricanes, that is what all the good teams in the NHL do, right? They attack in transition. They find a way to be deadly in transition. Vegas, all of them find a way to be deadly in transition. This team, this coaching staff wanted to do that. I really felt over the offseason, all of their moves really pointed towards them taking this approach. And then sure enough, once training camp started, that is what the coaching staff was saying. Those were the drills they were running. That was the system that they were installing. It just hasn't worked. It just has not worked for a bunch of reasons. Last week on the deep dive, I highlighted all of the issues with zone entries and the different ways that the Kraken have struggled to get those controlled zone entries that are so critical to attacking in transition. Because if you cannot enter the zone with the puck and with speed, you cannot attack in transition. That is a very key component of all of this. And because of their issues entering the zone with control of the puck, they have not been able to effectively attack in transition. They were able to at the beginning of the year for about 2 weeks. And then because they had such limited zone entries, as far as like options or how they went about doing it, I should say, how they went about entering the zone was so limited, other teams noticed, took away those easy plays along the boards, and we have not seen this team effectively able to attack in transition since then. Are they able to play here or there because the other team gets caught on a line change, or there's a defensive breakdown, or there's just the perfect breakout pass? Yes, I'm not saying it like never happens, but it does not happen consistently, and it doesn't happen and develop the way that I know the coaching staff was drawing it up for them. I know the way they're practicing and running their drills. Plays are not developing that way for the Kraken. They are not able to get it done. So much of that is on the zone entries. With both of those issues, though, if you know that other teams have made adjustments to your attack in transition and your team can no longer be effective at doing it, and in the defensive zone, you installed this system and it is just not working for one reason or another, you have to make adjustments at some point if you are the coaching staff. I understand what Dan was saying at the beginning of the year of give us 20 games. Guys got to learn the system. They've got to become comfortable in it. They've got to be able to build the chemistry with the other players so guys know like defensively which gaps to be taking through the neutral zone where players are going to be for attacking in transition, outlet passes from the defense in the defensive zone. They need to really build in that muscle memory of where to go or on certain looks where to look for the open player, maybe up by the blue line or in the neutral zone. I totally get all that. It is something that takes time and it's something that takes game reps, right? You can run all of these drills all you want, all training camp long into the preseason games, but you need some of those actual regular season game reps before you're going to have all that muscle memory down. I was totally on board with what Dan was saying about giving the team 20 games to build those habitual habits. The 20 games came and went. They maybe got a little bit better. Like I said, in that 20 games, the attack in transition was neutered by other teams, and there was no further adjustment work done really the rest of this season. It wasn't until very recently that we've started to see some adjustments made defensively. I think they were adjustments that needed to happen. I talked about it a couple weeks ago on the deep dive. You needed to collapse down in the defensive zone. You need to play better there. You need to take away those easy looks that other teams are having in your net front. It has still been an issue for them. I think you look at this, both of these last two Calgary games. In each game, there's an instance of a player being surrounded by four Kraken players in the slot, and they're able to score a goal on you. That's unacceptable. One of those four players needs to play physically. They need to poke check the puck. They need to take away that player's stick. It was Morgan Frost in the game in Seattle. It was Nazem Kadri sneaking into that spot, basically in Joey's crease in the game in Calgary. Both of those goals are inexcusable. Those goals cannot happen. Okay. And so as the Kraken are slowly starting to make that adjustment defensively, you got to communicate to the players that they have to play more physical. I know it is not how any of these defensemen want to play, even though they've all got size. So many of the defensemen on this team have the size to be able to play physically, and they just do not want to. They're going to have to start playing that way. You just do. If you want to win hockey games, you have to. When a player is walking in on you in those instances, you got to body them up. You've got to lay out a big hit on them. It's just hockey. Like I don't really know what else to say. I'm not normally a guy that's like all about the physical aspect of the game and like you should go out of your way to lay out big hits and gets everybody going and builds momentum, blah blah blah. That's not even what I'm talking about. I'm just straight up talking about don't give guys open looks at point blank range on your goaltender, right? And one of the ways you could do that is by physically getting in their way. So I think that that's one of the things that the Kraken need to do, and that needs to be taught to them from the coaching staff. That is something that the coaching staff needs to be communicating to them. For all I know, it is something that the coaching staff is communicating to them, but it's not appearing in games. And at the end of the day, yes, responsibility for that can fall on players, but more often than not, it is going to fall on the coaching staff. And so I think while changes and adjustments have needed to happen, I feel like those changes and adjustments are maybe starting to happen, but they're happening too late. 57 games in, when you've been sitting at a 1% playoff chance for over a month now, that's too late to make those adjustments, kind of recognize what things are working, what things aren't working, and then to go out, go out and play better. I know this is not the best roster in the world, right? This is not a Stanley Cup championship roster. I know that, and I know that there's maybe some things that you're not going to be able to do with the players that you have access to because you don't have that true superstar player. You don't have a bunch of guys that are going to be picked to an all-star game on this group. But you know what? There are things you can do to simplify the game for the group that you do have, and it will make them more effective it is just something that kind of needs to happen. And I feel like it has not happened from this group. On the flip side, things that I do like about this coaching staff. I like in some ways what we're seeing from the power play, right? This is maybe going to be the part where I'll still be a little negative, but I'm also going to talk about some positives. I think there maybe needs to be a little bit of clarity for people about like what the who's running the power play and stuff like that, because I know we've gotten different messaging from people in the community or around the power play. I agree the power play needs to be better. There's been far too many times this year where the power play has not looked dynamic. It has not looked all that great, and it is obvious that they are struggling out there. I do like the additions of the player movement on the power play, the different personnel groupings that we've maybe seen from them, and the idea of using the bumper a little bit more than the previous coaching staff's ideas for running the power play. I do think that all of that stuff is good. But for the power play, Coach Bob Woods is in charge of the power play with assistant coach Jess Campbell assisting on the power play. I will say this. I'll just kind of want to get that out there because it feels like everybody just associates the power play with Jess Campbell. But when it was introduced, this coaching staff was introduced to us over the offseason, that is how it was explained to us, was that Bob Woods is handling the power play. Jess is assisting Bob Woods in doing that. And I can say when we see them practice the power play, it's usually kind of before practice or before a morning skate. Each of them works with a different group at either end of the ice. So generally, Bob Woods is at the far end of the ice from where the media sits. Jess Campbell's working with the other power play unit on the near side to us. They're both out there. They're both working with the different units, doing the different drills that they want to, trying to get the different personnel groupings that they want, and work on the the chemistry of the player movement and all of that kind of stuff. So I just want to kind of throw that out there. I think one of the things that has been interesting about watching the power play, and particularly recently here, and I think this is where maybe some of the association with just assistant coach Jessica Campbell comes with the power plays, that Coach Jess is the one that is going to be doing all of the whiteboard work. So if there's a TV timeout during a power play or going into a power play, if the Kraken call a timeout going into a power play, something like that, Coach Jess is the one that is picking up the whiteboard, going and talking to the players, drawing up plays, trying to make things happen, just like if it's a goalie pull situation late in the game and there's that time to work on things. Jess is the one that is going to be drawing up those plays. And what we've seen recently from those situations is the Kraken convert on some power plays. It's looked pretty good. I've been very happy with what we've been able to see from what Coach Jess Campbell has been able to drop. Yeah, a couple of those situations have been 5-on-3. You should score in those situations, but I think the power play looks just it. Trying to think of like a good, not a qualifier, but a good adjective for it. The bottom line is it just looks better, right? It looks more dynamic when Jess has that time to draw something up for them. And so I'm wondering if it's just a matter of when Jess is drawing up a play for everybody, when the power play unit is able to kind of come together, huddle up, and they're able to kind of get a plan of action worked out. Is that them working against the system that they've been seeing in that game, right? Whatever penalty killing system and tendencies they've picked up from the other team? Or is it just getting all of the players onto the same page and giving them more direction than normal? And I would be very curious to know which of those two things it is. I think there is something to be said for noticing penalty killing tendencies from the other team and then working that into what you're going to draw up to try to exploit any deficiencies that you've noticed out there. I think that is something that makes a lot of sense. That's that game within a game kind of stuff that, exists around coaching in all sports. If it's just giving the guys a little bit more direction, reminding them what their job is out there, what the idea is that the power play is trying to accomplish, well, then that speaks to maybe some of the other issues that we've kind of long-standingly talked about with this group, and maybe goes to why the team starts slow and the issues with that they have, where it's just this is maybe a group that has some mental focus problems. And by huddling up, by being around coach with the whiteboard like that. It's just able to kind of refocus them. Again, like I said, it just gives them that direction to go in when they go out back out there on the ice on the power play, and then they are able to convert it because it's just fresher in their minds. I really hope it's not that. I really hope that it's more so the first thing where it's just picking up on cues from the PK and you're just going out there and exploiting them. But given the mental focus issues that we've seen from this team, trying to start games, trying to consistently play through games, trying to find ways to enter the zone, all of those things, I just unfortunately cannot rule out the other one. But I do think it's been undeniable, especially recently, when the power play is able to operate with a direction or exploit defense, whatever it is, when they're able to get a timeout going into a power play, those power plays look so much better than the power plays where they do not get that dedication, that direction, where they do not get that huddle up time, where they do not get to kind of sit there and diagram things out on the whiteboard with Coach Jess Campbell. They just look different, and that is something that it's not ideal. It's not ideal. You want that all the time. You shouldn't need to have those moments. You shouldn't need to call a timeout going into every power play, but that is where it is. Again, that's just the way it is. Um, the last thing that I want to talk about with the coaching staff, and this is definitely a reason why I like this coaching staff and why I want it to hang around, and that is with just player growth and development. And I just kind of want to talk again about why we were so excited to have Coach Dan Bilesma come up from Coachella Valley this offseason to become the coach of the Seattle Kraken, because he was down in CV, obviously had two phenomenal seasons coaching in the Valley down there, takes them to the Calder Cup finals both years, the Western Conference Championship, both champions both years. It's a phenomenal run of team success, but it was also all of the individual player success stories that existed within that group. And obviously, he had Coach Jess Campbell down there with him as part of that, and she's part of the coaching staff up here now as well. I think first and foremost, one that's got to be talked about is Joey Decord, and I think that we take it for granted how good Joey has been recently here, and he's been phenomenal for this team both last season and this season. But if we really think about Joey's journey to this point, I think you very much have to talk about that first season in Coachella Valley where he is the starter. He's able to lead them to overtime game 7 of the Calder Cup finals. And the work that Dan did, putting the right culture around Joey Decord for Joey Decord to kind of finally figure it out, right? Joey Decord had been around. He'd been in more than one NHL organization, right? By the time Coachella Valley exists and the Firebirds are playing, like Joey Decord has been around. I mean, he's 28 now. Like, he was not this like baby that the Kraken drafted and developed and he's turned into somebody for them. He was drafted in 2015. Okay, Joey had opportunities to break out and he didn't until he was with Coach Dan. And I think that that is something worth talking about. And we're seeing the phenomenal run that Joey has had this year, again, also under Coach Dan. I really do think there is something to the atmosphere that Coach Dan brings to a team that has really unlocked and gotten the most out of goaltender Joey Decord. That's a reason in and of itself to like Coach Dan and like what the team is doing. I also think that I look at this different skaters and I look at guys like Ty Cartier, a Logan Morrison who's still down in CV, but a Shane Wright, all of the players who have played for Coach Dan at Coachella Valley and how they've developed. Riker Evans, right? You're talking about players with different draft pedigrees, high draft pedigree in a Shane Wright, higher draft pedigree in a second round pick like a Riker Evans, turning into very good everyday NHL players who are, obviously still developing, still growing into their own at the NHL level, but playing very solidly in the minutes that they're given and in the roles that they've been in. Talking about lower level guys, a guy like Ty Cartier, and I know that there's been talk around Ty Cartier. Should he be benched? Should he be playing right now for the Kraken? Disappointment that he hasn't maybe blossomed into more at the NHL level. And I'll just kind of reiterate what I said at the beginning of the season, which was, look, Ty Cartier is an undrafted player. He shouldn't be here. He shouldn't be in this spot at all where he's played as many games in the NHL as he has. The reason he's here is one, the very hard work that he has put in, and the dedication that he has put in to get himself here through, working hard, learning as much as he can, doing all of the different jobs that have been asked of him out there on the ice to earn the opportunities to play more, and then eventually get that call up a couple years ago, in the playoffs to then cement himself as an NHL player. But it's also been the work of Coach Dan Bosma and what he was doing that first year in CV that took in Ty Cartier and spat out an NHL player, right? We've seen the same thing. Logan Morrison has looked okay in limited Kraken action and has certainly looked good at the CV level. Undrafted player comes in, works with Coach Dan, becomes a much better player than players like that are supposed to be. And I really think if this team is going to be one that really has to develop around their young players, if their identity is going to have to be Shane, Maddie, to a lesser extent, Capo Caco and Riker Evans, whoever you draft, seemingly top five, which is what you're on pace for this season. I think having a coaching staff built around somebody like Dan Bausma, who can directly connect with those players, knows how to push them, knows which spots to put them in to get the most out of them as they're growing and developing their games, which spots that limit their, rookie downside, limits their growing pains, but also gives them the most chance to build confidence for themselves, can handle something like Shane, maybe going in the wrong direction earlier this season, then scratches him, communicates with him, and then turns him into the player that we've seen post scratch, which I have the numbers up for him right here. 36 games since Shane Wright was scratched, 29 points in those 36 games, 11 goals. Like that's phenomenal work. Does Shane do that after he's scratched under Dave Hackstall? It's possible, but I really think that personal connection that Dan is able to make with guys and the relationship that he already had with Shane Wright is a big part of why Shane has responded so well and so consistently well after that scratch, where we haven't really seen huge droughts from Shane after that. It wasn't like he came out scoring, hit another lull or rookie wall, and then kind of went. It's just been very steady production. A lot of those points have just been 1 point per game, right? Just kind of contributing night in, night out. And I know there's the question around the playing time. I would give him more ice time too, but I really think that a large portion of why Dan is here and why I like Dan being here is because this is a team that needs to develop around its young core. And I think Dan is the person to do that. And that's partly why I want Dan to be here. And then that kind of finally brings me to my last point that I want to talk about. And that is, what is the identity of this team? What is the future of this team? What is the culture of this locker room and of this organization? And this was another thing that we talked about the other night, and I think it deserves to get talked about again, and that is just, this was a team going through the expansion draft, process, where you're taking NHL veterans from 32 different organizations that have 32 different cultures about them, and you're putting them all together into a locker room. It's very hard then for that locker room to come up with its own culture, because you have a bunch of different guys coming in with a bunch of different ideas. We've talked about the whole, captaincy issue, where you have Mark Giordano at the beginning of that. He leaves mid-year, year one. You don't have a captain again until the beginning of this year with Jordan Eberle, and how it's just felt like there are leaders in that room. There's guys that are capable of being leaders in that room, but maybe no one voice has kind of ascended above the rest and kind of molded the locker room culture into a specific image. And I mentioned on the post game the other night, organizations can really kind of build that locker room culture and that organizational culture. And I do think the organizational culture is important here. You can build that, but generally you build that around individuals. Usually it's either a team that is bad and has been tanking and has now drafted their future franchise cornerstone, and then the entire culture becomes, we're going to build ourselves up around this player, and that is what's important, and the focus of everybody in the organization is around that. Think of teams like the Chicago Blackhawks with Connor Bedard, the Sharks this past offseason with Macklin Celebrini, right? The culture is these are our guys. They're going to lead us into the future. We need to do whatever we can to then put the best group around them, the best group that's going to help them develop. And then at some point, that shifts to becoming competitive around them. And I think the Sharks are a great example of this past offseason with the moves that they made. They go out, they sign in Alex Wenberg, who can then come in and chew up the tough minutes down the middle so Macklin Celebrini doesn't have to worry about those matchups his rookie year. You go out and you sign a winger like a Tyler Toffoli, somebody who is consistently proven that he can be a finisher at the NHL level, playing with a variety of different types of players, so that regardless of what Macklin Celebrini is going to look like at the NHL level, he has somebody on his wing that if he gets him the puck, he can put it in the back of the net, right? To Foley. I think that that's really important. It helps a guy like Macklin Celebrini build confidence, understand things about the NHL, and all of that. I think that that's one way of going about it is you can build up your organization around a specific player. I think year one it was going to be difficult to do that around the concept of drafting Matty Beniers second overall because the team was brand new. You had just gone through that expansion draft. Everything was so in flux that was not really the time that it was going to be easy to kind of build around a player like that, especially when that player goes back to Michigan, goes back to college, just kind of comes in for 10 games at the end of the year. It's hard. It was a difficult situation for them to kind of build around Maddie from an organizational level like that. And I think there was probably differences in opinions about how good this team could be out of the gate, right? Are they going to be drafting and developing it? Is this a longer term strategy? Or is this one where, we're maybe not expecting Vegas levels of success, but can we get going a little bit quicker? You then draft Shane Wright. Shane, again, kind of same thing. He's not going to come into the NHL level and play right away. It just didn't really work out that way for him that first year. And you kind of had that awkward situation where for months on end, it's are we sending him back to junior? What's kind of the situation? He's just kind of hanging around the NHL level, but he's not really getting into games. He's not playing significant minutes, all of that kind of stuff. And I think that again, that showed some maybe wishy-washy. Are we a young developing team or are we kind of going for it? We're off to a hot start. This is year two, remember, right? We've got super high shooting percentage. We're getting goaltending from guys like Martin Jones. What are we? Are we going for the playoffs or are we going to try to build around a young Matty Beniers now in his first full season, a Shane Wright who we've made the decision to not send to junior right away and we do want around this squad. And that kind of back and forth nature, that lack of organizational cohesion, I think really kind of played out in front of us during that year. They ultimately decided to go and make the push and build the best team that they could for that season. And you know what? We got that wonderful playoff run. You go to a game seven in the second round. It was fantastic. But I think the ramifications of that were then year three, you go in and the organization is maybe now more on the board with the okay, we're maybe a little bit closer to competing than we initially thought back when we started all this. Let's go for it. Let's go out there and let's try to make the most of it. And then you don't get the luck with the shooting percentage. You don't get as great and all the luck on the goaltending side of things. And season three develops the way that it does. And that's where you hit this kind of crucial offseason, which was the organization was again faced with what are we? Are we going to be a team that's going to focus on our young core group of players and we're going to kind of slow the roll and pull back maybe a little bit from what we were trying to do last year and let's just try to build up our young core and let's make that the focus of the organization? Or do we go out and do we spend the money and we try to turn this thing back into a playoff team? And we make that push again and that's our expectation is to make the playoffs. And I feel like there there was not agreement. I don't know this for sure, but it really does feel like from the outside and just based on the moves that they made that there was not necessarily agreement on which direction to go there. And I think that there was some people who wanted to push to get better, and that's where you see the signings of a Brandon Montour and a Chandler Stevenson. Those are very much win now signings. And then I think you see the hiring of a coach in Dan Bylsma, which was, yeah, he can win now. He's winning in CV. But really, the big strength of what he had been doing in Coachella Valley was he was developing young players and turning them into professionals, turning them into guys that could have NHL futures. And I think that the two of those things just didn't mesh. And I think that's why we really find ourselves in this spot. And I think at some point the organization needs to pick a direction and they need to pick a person to build around, and that can either be a coach or a player. There's plenty of examples of teams building around a young player, like I talked about. You have a chance to maybe do that with a Berkeley Catton if you want to reset in that direction. But you can also pick a coach, and I think of the Florida Panthers, just to use them as an example again. They built around Paul Maurice and what Paul Maurice's identity was as far as a play style and what he was going to expect his players to do, and those brutal training camp practices that everybody talks about. But the whole organization was behind Paul Maurice's vision for what that team was going to turn into, right? Bill Zito got on board with it, started bringing in players that fit the vision, that fit the system that they were going to do. Bill Zito being the general manager of the Florida Panthers. It was all around the identity of Paul Maurice, which was we're going to work hard, we're going to do these things the right way. The regular season doesn't really matter as long as we get to the postseason and then we play a certain style. We're going to do that, and I'm going to work you to the bone so that you're prepared for the grind that is the Stanley Cup playoffs. And it has paid off in back-to-back Stanley Cup Finals appearances and a Stanley Cup championship. And so I think that is also an option for the Kraken is you can, if you pick a coach, you can build your team around that coach. It does not always go well. I don't necessarily think that it's the best move. I think it, there's some examples of it like with Paul Maurice in Florida, but Florida already had like a good core group of players there. I think of situations where it doesn't work as well, and I think of things like Mike Babcock in Toronto back when that was a thing, or here more recently and currently in the NHL, John Tortorella and the Philadelphia Flyers. I don't think it's the best direction to go, but I wouldn't have hated if the Kraken went in that direction this year with Coach Dan Bylsma, which was just let's go with Dan's philosophy. Let's just focus on developing our young players, give Shane more ice time, get him out there and let him go. And I think that could have been a good option for them as well. But I think moral of the story, the organization has to decide and everybody's got to get on board. Ownership, front office, coaching staff, locker room. All four of those things need to get on board with one cohesive plan. And that either needs to be that they are a team that is developing around a young core and you're just going to suffer growing pains, and whatever results come are the results. But as long as those young pieces are taking steps forward, you're all good. Or are you going to try to push to make the playoffs in year 5 and you want to be a playoff team and you're going to do whatever you feel like you have to do to make that happen, including maybe trading away some prospects for some win now pieces and being aggressive in free agency and being aggressive with the salary cap? I know I would pick the slower, build it up from the ground option, but I, at this point, just want an organization that has a very clear vision, communicates that vision to us, and we see it, play out in front of us. And I think that's what a lot of Kraken fans want as well. It sure seems like that from our post game lives, from all the conversations that we have with all of you. So with that said, kind of a transition from the coaching staff to the front office. I'll hand it off to RJ to kind of finish out the rest of the meat of this podcast. But those are my thoughts on where we're at this season with the Kraken.
Now I want to go on to kind of the main thing I've been thinking about with this team, and that is the big picture and kind of where the Kraken are at right now, what they can do about it, and why I think the main takeaway has to be that Ron Francis should not be back next year. And so I want to talk about the situation of this franchise right now, and kind of give it some proper context, because I think it's really important to do that, because look, frankly, I'm kind of feeling like I'm already seeing the spin machine start to kick into gear a little bit with people maybe trying to save their jobs. And I worry that the end result is just going to be more mediocrity for this franchise. So I'll expand on that a little bit later, but just know I don't want to sound too doom and gloom here, because Kraken coming off a really fun win to go into the break, and I don't want to put everyone in a bad mood for this. But the reason I'm kind of laying all this out here is because I feel like it is a big step, and I don't take it lightly to say that the GM shouldn't come back. But I feel like, if you're going to make that case, you've got to really put it out there why a change needs to be made. And so that's what I'm going to try and do here. Because I think just in the coming months, you listening to this right now, you as a fan are going to be sold a vision and kind of told that this was all part of the plan and that things are on the right track. And I feel a responsibility to be honest with you and tell you why I don't think that's the case. So let's just kind of, dive in here. And I just want to look at real quick, in the short term, where this team is. So, of course, they're 28th out of 32 NHL teams. They're bottom five in the standings. We all know that. We've been talking about that forever. They're not going to make the playoffs. And realistically, they were out of the playoff hunt by Christmas. So that's all there. And then I think it is worth mentioning again. I brought it up, a few times in the past, like the underlying numbers show that this team is actually kind of fortunate to be where they are. Like the two usual proxies for luck, goaltending and finishing. The Kraken have had some of the best goaltending and finishing of any NHL team this season. Like Joey Decord has been excellent. And I know Grubauer's, the goaltending numbers are pretty bad, but you look at just team goaltending, which takes all that into account, it weighs out to they've had some excellent goaltending, even relative to the league, and then finishing. They're like one of the best finishing teams in the league too. And then on top of that, their penalty differential is among the best. Like they get a lot of the calls, and I think part of that is being a disciplined team. Dan's talked about wanting to be so disciplined, but I think it goes a little bit beyond that. And again, all I have as far as a frame of reference is like my, you know, what 20 something years of just following, as far as just following one team, right? Sorry, with following the San Jose Sharks from like the first post lockout year, and then following the Seattle Kraken, starting when they came into the league. And through all of those seasons, I will say, just like from the eye test, because the numbers say that the penalty differential is very good for the Kraken. They've been benefiting from the calls. From the eye test, I can tell you, I have never seen a team get such preferential treatment from the officials over the course of a full season as this year's Kraken team. And I know given the last few games, a lot of you might really be scratching your head at that, but I'm telling you, the numbers back it up. And from what I'm seeing, that just seems to be the case. They get away with a lot. And the teams they're playing against don't usually get away with a lot. So all of this is to say that they've, in the areas that you traditionally look at for getting lucky or kind of things where they can be random or have some variance, the Kraken have really benefited from that this season, which seems odd kind of given where they're at in the standings. But I really think this is not a borderline playoff team that's run into some bad luck. This is a bottom three team that has actually been elevated by good luck. So that's the product on the ice right now. I mean, Dylan and I talk about it after every game. We talk about it every week on the podcast. I feel like I don't need to say much more about that. We all know what this team is on the ice. But I think there is some important off ice context too. I mean, the Kraken made a new TV deal, Kraken Hockey Network coming in. It's their first season. And I think everybody from ownership all the way down knew that like it was crucial that this year the team put out a good on ice product for the tons of additional people that would be watching and would be, I think it's important that they would be playing meaningful games all year. I think that's something that was kind of built into expectations for this year. And frankly, in that respect, this has been the worst case scenario. Like I think you could not have done any worse from a results perspective. Like even if they were 10 points worse than they are right now, like down where San Jose is, I think it's easier then to just kind of sell the future as opposed to just kind of having to do this little dance of pretending that you're not out of it that they've had to do for the last month. And so when you compare, the reality this season to the expectations, that's very important. Because remember this when we kind of talk about expectations a little bit later too. But that's the short term. So now, for the medium to longer term, I mean, the Kraken have a collection of players currently on the roster that, at least altogether as it is right now, clearly are not the answer. As we just went over, it's a bottom three team probably as far as results. And you got to remember, the Kraken are paying top dollar for this group. This team is capped out. They could not ice a full roster to start the season. And compared to the results on the ice, I mean, it's just not good. I mean, the Athletic, they did a ranking of every team's salary cap situation this season, and the Kraken were ranked 30th out of 32 NHL teams cap wise. And that's just looking at the cap situation in its entirety. And I think that's, pretty right on the nose, just given that you have a top five payroll in the league and you're getting bottom five results. It's kind of a line that Dylan and I have talked about a lot this season. But That just is what it is. And you look at the contracts individually. I mean, the Grubauer contract, Burakovsky, Stevenson, they all have significant negative value right now. There are some good deals in there. You got McCann, you've got Vince Dunn, Joey's contract extension looks pretty good, but on balance, there's a lot more bad than good in that salary sheet. And of course, with the cap going up, flexibility is coming. And Ron Francis could point to that, but I think you could say that for any team. And so, you look at the short term situation where the team has clearly not met expectations, despite spending to the cap. You look at the medium and longer term situation where the cap situation, the contract situation, just this team that's been built is not very good. And there's some bad contracts there that have a lot of term. And it's just short of any expectations that you should have, especially starting with a clean slate 4 years ago, as Ron Francis did. And then finally, you look at long term, and I think this is the positive that a lot of people will point to, and I think it's probably going to be the biggest argument that Francis can make as to why he should stick around. And I've heard this from people, whether it's in chat, in comments on social media, and even some people up in the press box who I've kind of debated this with. If you're listening, you'll know who you are. But making the argument essentially that Ron Francis deserves to be able to stick around and kind of see the results of the prospect pool and the players that he's drafted. And I just don't think that argument really makes any sense. And so we'll look at the prospect pool because it is good. I think it's ranked top 10 by a lot of people, and they have a very good prospect pool. And there's a lot of solid players there that are going to help. I think the one concern with it is maybe the lack of potential stars or superstar type players. I think Berkeley Catton is really the only one who could find his way into that area. But overall, pretty darn good. But you look at this prospect pool, and I think, I mean, where to start with this? Because I have like a few different points, and I didn't, I want to. It's not organized the best, but I guess we'll start with what that prospect pool actually means, and how do you weigh it in terms of like the roster that's been built and the negatives there. I think prospects, and Dylan could, I'd love Dylan to be here and kind of shed some light on this. Just but in general, prospects, like, they carry the highest amount of uncertainty. And I have talked to Dylan about this group of prospects, and I think the agreement we kind of come to is just like, yeah, some of them are going to turn into good players. We don't know how many or which. Like, they're not all going to be stars. They're not all even going to be NHLers. But like, one of like Rakoff, Furcus, Chalet, like one of those guys is going to be a really good top six guy. Don't know which one it is, but like one of those is going to turn into something good. Maybe two, if you're lucky. And just kind of down on the line, like Ty Nelson, Caden Price, like one of those guys might probably turn into like a good top four defenseman. And so you kind of just play the percentages there. And like, it's good, but there's no like kind of franchise savior there outside of maybe Berkeley Catton. And then I also got the question, I think it was last night, one of the post games was, well, the drafting's been really good. Why don't we keep Ron Francis just for the drafting? And I understand that sentiment, but I think we need to understand also kind of how NHL drafting works. Because really for drafting in the NHL, the GM doesn't really have time to do all the intense scouting that the scouts do. A lot of drafting in the NHL is on the scouts. And GMs will tell you this. They will be upfront about this. Like, the GM does make the final say. He's got to be the final decision maker because there's different scouts. I'll pick my guy. But often the only real input a GM will have as far as like making a pick himself or really making an informed decision just from his own knowledge is on the first round picks. Like with Matty Beniers second overall, Ron Francis, I bet you, is making that decision, right? Because he has enough information with the very top guys. He's seen them enough. He knows which direction he wants to go. Shane Wright, same thing. Although, that one kind of fell into his lap. But later than that in the draft, second round and on, it's really all on the scouts. And the GM relies very heavily on what his scouting staff, and in the Kraken's case too, like the analytics staff is telling him. Like, I know Namita Nandakumar does fantastic work, on the analytics side with the amateur players that the Kraken are looking to draft. And so that's really where this good late round drafting is coming from. And I don't want to necessarily take it away from Ron Francis because he is making the final decision, but ask any GM that's kind of how drafting works. And so I think if you keep the scouting staff and you keep the analytics staff, which that certainly happens when GMs change, I think there's no reason to believe that that drafting would get worse if it's the same people doing it. So I think it's important to kind of give credit where it's due for that later round drafting, and especially for this prospect pool that the Kraken have built. So and even I could go into like passing on maybe guys like Lane Hudson, who was out there, and like they haven't been perfect. There have been kind of maybe a few looks like whiffs early on, but overall the overall body of work is very good. But I just wanted to be clear about kind of how that works. And then I guess the other thing, as far as the drafting and the build and the timeline and everything, um, I think one of the things that Francis and his supporters are going to maybe try to say is that, yeah, he wants to take this slow approach. He wants to do a build through the draft. And he has mentioned that from even before the expansion draft. We're going to do this thing right. We're going to build through the draft. But I don't know that that gels with a timeline that anybody is really happy with. And I don't fully buy that he was trying to just do just a total build through the draft type of thing. I think that's some revisionist history there, because if you are doing an entirely draft based build where like you're really going to wait to be competitive until those guys can help you, that's a 6 to 7 year window, I think, before you really even start to be competitive. Um, and I don't think that's what anybody signed up for when this team started. I don't think if you told them, yeah, we're looking at year 6 or 7 before we're really looking to be competitive, that seems off with where the expectations were, even though they were kind of lowered. No one knew everyone knew it wasn't going to be Vegas, but I think that's too long. You look at the guys who are, contributing right now. Yes, you've got Matty Beniers, Shane Wright, your first rounders. You got Riker Evans, your 1 second rounder. He was an overager. But you look at the 2021, 2022 draft picks, like Ottavainen's not ready yet. The 2022 second rounders, Rakoff and like all those second rounders. Coco, of course, he's a goalie. He's going to take longer, but like those guys are 2 to 3 years away from now to really being able to contribute to a team and do what they're supposed to do. So I don't think the whole draft based build, it requires more patience than I think anybody really had at the start. And maybe you can try and sell it now as they're a little bit closer, but again, I'm just not buying that. And also, if you did want to go with the draft based build, I think you needed to get more 2021 draft picks, that first draft you participated in, because you can't wait for those 2022, 2023 guys to really make an impact. Because then you're talking 7, 8 years down the line. Like that's if they were really going for a total draft based build through the draft type of thing. I think you put in more effort around the expansion draft to get more draft picks in 2021. They only had their original 7 that they were given. They did not add a single extra draft pick in that first draft. And I mean, if you're looking at the timeline here, and that's the key, like you need more urgency there. But instead, I think they loaded up on picks in 2022, which, by the way, was a year that everyone was impacted by COVID. Like we're seeing that with Shane Wright and how the development track is kind of longer for him. Like this was all post COVID. They knew that draft class would be affected in that way. I just that's kind of one of the reasons I'm not buying it with the draft, with the build through the draft type of thing. I think the plan was always a little bit different just because it's failed, kind of leaning back on that build through the draft thing. And that's another reason I don't think he, quote unquote, deserves to see those prospects come to fruition. I think that's just too much leash there. And then finally, and this is a bit of an aside here, but I want to address something that we talked about a little bit on the last post game, but really didn't have time to fully get into. I wanted to expand on it here, and that's just that this team has never really had an identity, and that's kind of striking through 4 years. That, and I know team identity, it's one of those cliches that's kind of thrown around a bunch, and you hear it in the interviews, and what does it even mean? But I do think team identity is actually really important. And through 4 years, like I don't think we've ever gone more than maybe a month where we've kind of had a clear idea of the way that this team wants to play. That's Kraken hockey, baby. That it's meant many different things over the years. But I think we should have a clear idea of how the Kraken are going to play when they play well. Are they a low scoring, grinded out type of team? Are they want to win 2-1 games? Are they a free flowing, creative, up tempo team? Do they want to force teams to play with speed and try and win 4-5? There hasn't really been a proper vision from the start, I think, of how this team is supposed to play. And I think that comes from the top, right? If you are the GM, you're kind of orchestrating how you want to build a team. Of course, you work with a coach that has their own idea of what they want to do, but of course, as the GM, you're the one that hires the coach. So I will say, as far as team identity, like I don't want to say just there's no identity, there's never been any plan, because that's not true. There was supposed to be an identity this season, and that is speed. They were supposed to be a fast team that just hit you with speed, hit you in transition, and frankly, that identity lasted about, 7-8 games, if that. Lasted like 2 weeks before other teams just kind of realized they could take that away and adjust. Like the Kraken simply just, and maybe Dylan talked about this, I don't know, but I hope he did, that the Kraken just simply did not have players that were good enough to run that system. And the systems that all the successful teams run, there just wasn't enough talent there for them to effectively run it, and especially for something speed based where you got to dictate the pace. Kraken just haven't been able to do that all season, and so you had your plan A that didn't work as far as an identity, and it's really hard when you go into a season 2 weeks in and you got to find a plan B on the fly, and they haven't. They just have not found anything. They kind of tried, more of a grinding type game. It worked for a little bit, but they just didn't have the personnel to run that either. I think probably the closest the Kraken have ever had to an identity was year two. And of course, we all remember year two and how great that was. And I think the identity there was depth scoring. Remember, it was the depth is going to kill you, the depth of the Kraken. Every line's going to score, particularly that fourth line. That fourth line was super dangerous. And it was something that no other team really had. And then, for better or worse, you scrapped the entire fourth line after that season. Now, I'm not saying they should have kept them. I mean, this is a whole other thing I could go into. We argued the heck out of this going into year three, but um, you know, you could argue that fourth line wasn't sustainable, and I'd probably agree with you. But fact is, you got rid of them, and now you're back to no identity, as you want a more traditional fourth line for where they don't contribute as much depth scoring, and then you don't have the scoring depth, and so you're back to no identity. And man, did it show in last year's team under Hackstall, just kind of how they didn't really have that identity of the way they wanted to play anymore, and the way they played in year two just wasn't working because they didn't have the same personnel. So that's the other thing that it's just through 4 years from the person at the top, you need to have a team identity and a way that you want to play. And I know that he and Bilesman kind of tried to pick one this season, but it didn't work. And that's something that I think Francis has to be held accountable for, in addition to the coaching staff, but he's the guy at the top. So there it is. I'll stop a little bit with the negativity here. I've laid it all out. You have a team playing bottom of the league hockey with no identity and a cap situation that is among the worst in the NHL with a promising prospect pool. And again, I feel like I've missed a ton of detail, and I could, spend an hour on like each of these points. But that's the situation that the Kraken are in. Now, why is this important? Because big decisions have to be made this offseason about the future of the franchise. And I'm worried that the people who inherited a blank slate and created everything that I just described are going to keep the keys to the ship. And yeah, I'm primarily referring to Ron Francis. And I think when you look back at the team's failures over the last 4 years, everything points back to him. And look, I'm not going to relitigate the expansion draft. I'll probably do like a 2 or 3 hour video one day just about that. But like the important point is that he started off with a clean slate with no contracts to speak of on this team. And I don't know how anyone could deny, for better or worse, whatever you think of it, he built this. He built the current situation the Kraken are in. Like this is his doing. It's his work. He did this. He inherited a blank slate, and this is what he's created. And so I think, at the end of the day, the the reality is that it just didn't meet expectations. And so I mean, there's a few different elements and like directions I could go here with this. Also, I think it's worth noting that like he created a blank slate in a flat cap environment where cap space was golden, but that goes into kind of relitigating the expansion draft, which I won't do right now. But and I know there's been the debate too about, is it Francis or is it the coaching? Because you look at Dave Haxtell and the team last year, and I think this year's team is supposed to be. I mean, if they're on pace to be worse than last year's team was with supposed upgrades that were made right in Brandon Montour and Chandler Stevenson. And so, I don't think the coaching is blameless. I think, the coaching, there's an element where, they could probably do better. But if it is the coaching, guess who picked the coaches? That's Ron Francis. I mean, that is his job as a GM to pick the coaches. So if the coach isn't right, then he's the guy who picked the coach. And that also just kind of circles back to him. And then I know there's the reports, of course, that, that maybe Dan Bilesma wasn't his guy, that maybe he wanted Todd McClellan. And that may be true. I mean, I think notably Francis went on TV and he didn't deny it. He did not deny that report. He just said, Dan's the coach. I hired Dan. He is the coach, but that doesn't really deny that, or say that he didn't want somebody else. But, and I mentioned this a little bit at the time after that interview, but like, okay, say he didn't pick the coach, say that was ownership or whoever else in the front office that kind of swayed him in that direction, and that it wasn't really his call. And same thing, I guess, reportedly he didn't want to fire Hackstall. But if that wasn't really his call, I think that's even more damning. I think really, and I hope that's not the case, because really, if that is the case, that shows that he's not even a real GM. At that point, if he is not making a decision as important as who the coach is going to be. And also, I mean, this was part of, I was, debating this with somebody in the press box a few days ago, saying that, well, maybe he didn't want to hire the coach that they hired, and maybe he didn't want to, bring in Stevenson and Montour, but maybe ownership was kind of nudging him that you got to go out and spend and make these moves and kind of ramp it up for this season. That all might be the case. And then, then the blame for those sorts of things goes to wherever that pressure came from, maybe ownership, maybe I don't know. And I certainly can't confirm that any of this is the case. I don't know, but I'm saying it's damning either way, because either it's Francis making these decisions, and again, it's then his failures he needs to, take accountability for, or if he's not the one making these decisions, those situations never work well when you have, ownership really, or whoever else pulling the strings, and the guy who is on paper entrusted to be in charge is not actually in charge. And so if that's the case, and you need to bring in a GM who at least ownership can trust to be autonomous and to make all the decisions, because I think the best way to run an organization is, not to have that meddling from ownership, which again, I don't know if it's there. I'm not saying that it's there. So I just want to be very clear. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, but if that is the case, you need to have a GM that ownership trusts to just entrust the franchise to completely, and let him or her make decisions. Um, and so either way, that just looks really, really damning, I think. And so, that's, I think really any way you look at it, it all kind of circles back to Ron Francis as at least just the one responsible for what's going on here. And I kind of outlined just how they haven't met expectations. And speaking of expectations, just if I can, go on about one more thing, like one thing I never really liked about, kind of Francis and how he's approached things is just that he's kind of tried to lower expectations from day one. Like from the very beginning, it was, we're not Vegas. Don't expect that. It's a slow build. I think he kind of floated the 3 to 5 year plan out there at the time, but and to an extent, that's fine. Like, again, I understand given how Vegas did, nobody should have expected a cup final appearance year one. That was never happening. But I feel like people were already kind of there. No one was expecting Vegas like results. But it's one thing to say, okay, we're not going to be Vegas, and that's okay. But it's another thing to never really, I don't know, he never really had any defined expectations or a timeline for what we were supposed to see. And it kind of moved around. I mean, it was, 3 to 5 years at first. And then after the success year 2, maybe you move that timeline up a little bit after year 3. I mean, we haven't really gotten any clarity on a timeline, except for just the fact that after year 2, going into year 3, I asked him, point blank, and what would be a successful season for you? And he said making the playoffs. And he said that's our goal every year. Going into this season, same thing, same question. He said, make the playoffs. And he says, and he's not wrong, that you get into the top 8, you make the playoffs, and anything can happen. And I really do believe that. You get into the playoffs, chaos happens. So making the playoffs, I think that's a solid goal, and it's the goal he's set for himself and the team the last 2 years. That's the only defined goal that they've really had. They've fallen short of it. I guess I'm getting ahead of myself here, but as far as an overall timeline to be regularly competitive, there's never really been any defined expectations there. And whatever expectations there have been, especially in the last 2 years, he's just been trying to lower them and lower them and lower them. And I think it's dangerous when you have, a kind of a culture of lowering expectations, and you compare it to that of Bill Foley in Vegas, where I know the Kraken weren't going to have those results early on. Bill Foley didn't think Vegas was going to have those results early on, but he did say from day one, from the very start, playoffs in 3 years, Stanley Cup in 6. And he, as the owner, put himself out there and said, these are what the expectations are, and we're going to hold ourselves to that. And that's great. I love creating a standard and holding yourself to it. And I mean, to their credit, they did it. I mean, they exceeded expectations, but they won the Stanley Cup in 6. And that's, look, while I think a lot went right for them, and you could go into all their roster moves and all the way, everything that they did, it's not as simple as setting expectations. It's easy to say, yeah, we're going to win the cup in 6 years. It's another thing to actually do it. And so I'm not saying the expectations are the reason that it happened, but I do think that mindset has something to do with it. And the way that they operate, and look, I don't necessarily think you need to be as cutthroat as Vegas is, but they do not accept mediocrity. And I think you look around the league and in other sports leagues too, there are teams that do not accept mediocrity, and they're largely more successful. And that is one issue that I kind of have with the culture and everything, where there hasn't really been, a defined expectations, or I hate to borrow this phrase from Al Davis and the Raiders, given the last, 20 years of how they've done. But think about their prime years when Davis wasn't kind of too old to run things, but a commitment to excellence. And I just don't really see that here. And if they are going to hold themselves to a standard, to a high standard of that commitment to, I mean, heck, even not excellence, but making the playoffs, that's a low bar. If they're going to hold themselves that standard, I don't see how you keep Ron Francis around, given 2 seasons of playoffs being the expectation, and they both, are not even close to being met, and the trend arrow is going down. So I worry. That's, I guess, why I even went into this whole, this whole topic, is just that I worry that, that mediocrity is going to be accepted and okay. And I just don't think this franchise can really afford that, especially with the Sonics coming back and just fighting for a spot in this sports landscape. I think they have to at least be making the playoffs if they want to go that direction. The other way you could go is just kind of rebuild and try and go, win a Stanley Cup in 5 or, in 6 or 7 years, and just kind of rebuild from now. I don't want to do that, but that's the other way you could go. But I don't think that's a realistic option. So that's, that's all I'm saying here, really. And I guess I ought to just wrap this up, but thank you everybody for listening to this deep dive podcast. Sorry if it kind of felt too doom and gloom and negative at times, but yeah, this has just been the stuff that's been on my mind about the way the season has gone and kind of where the Kraken are at. So I'm sure there'll be plenty of comments, plenty of asks for clarification on some of these things, and I'll be happy to give it and kind of make that case later into the season. But yeah, I think I guess I'll close it out by saying I do think there's a lot of optimism and hope for the future, because there's a lot of flexibility coming up. There are changes that can be made. I think that drastic changes need to be made, but they can be made and things can turn around rather quickly. I mean, look at the Washington Capitals, and what they were able to do just in one short off season. I think the Kraken can turn things around. It's going to take some bold decisions. It's going to take some trades. It's going to take some major roster moves. And it's all stuff I think can be done, and they've got the flexibility to do it. I just think they need somebody else in there who that's a little bit more of their MO, is making those big moves, making those bold decisions. I just don't think that Ron Francis is the guy to do it. But I do think the future is bright. You just got to have the right person entrusted with that future. So that's, uh, I guess that'll be kind of my last word here. And man, I miss Dylan. I miss Dylan. Bring Dylan back.
Ask and you shall receive. RJ, I am back. Now, I just want to build off of what RJ was talking about there at the end before I go ahead and sign off and we close out this week's podcast. And that is that the future is bright. Obviously, RJ talked about prospect pool, ranked top 10 by most. You know, it's got a ton of great players. Talk about it every month over on the Patreon, going through the prospect pool with my prospect chats. I love a lot of what the Kraken have done as far as drafting and then developing and getting these players to go. I just want to close out by talking about a little bit what I'd said before with Dan developing the young players on the roster right now. And I just thought I'd kind of highlight how Matty Beniers and Shane Wright are doing, because they are the young pieces on the NHL roster that are, you know, easier to track than say Riker Evans as a defenseman, just from a production standpoint, and just to kind of leave everybody on a positive note of how these young players are developing and how this is, you know, should be how the team kind of finishes out the year, is making sure that both these guys continue to take steps forward in time for season 5 to start next year. And that is with Matty Beniers, since he's been on a line with Jaden Schwartz and Capo Caco. So coming out of the Christmas break anyway is kind of where I drew the line there with that first game in Vancouver. Matty Beniers has played 21 games, 13 points, but 9 goals in 21 games. Really woke up the goal scorer inside Matty Beniers. He's averaging nearly 2 shots per game, and he's doing all of that while facing very stiff competition on the other side, while playing 19.55 a night, picking up PK time, all of that stuff. Matty Beniers very much developing into that solid two-way center. We're seeing that goal production from him kind of finally. I think that's all good and positive from a development standpoint. And then just again to give the Shane Wright numbers since his scratch earlier this season: 36 games, 29 points, 11 goals. I mean, what we're seeing from him is just stellar production. You take those numbers from anybody in their first year, and especially when you do talk about the ice time. He's doing that in only 14.05 of ice time in that 36 games. I mean, it's just good work. Like, everything that he's doing is just fantastic. He's contributing on special teams, on the power play. He's really taken a step forward this second half of the season. I mean, you take that from your young guy when you're talking about half a season being nearly a point per game player. It's really great development what we're seeing from Shane Wright and Matty Beniers here, and hopefully it continues. I think it will continue the rest of the way, and I can't wait to go through the rest of the season with everybody on the backside of the Four Nations tournament. No podcast next week. That's partly why this week's is so long, just to help tide everybody over while the Four Nations break is going on here. But I appreciate everybody listening. Want to one more time shout out our wonderful sponsor, the law offices of Rico Tessendor. While we hope none of you need his services, the odds say at some point someone out there will be involved in an accident, whether on the road, again, those icy road conditions, got to watch out for those, at work or anywhere in between. And when you are, we hope you call Rico at 425-778-9800 or visit his website, ricotessendor.com, to schedule a free consultation. Appreciate all of you listening, and we will see you all next time.
Hey everyone, before we go, we just wanted to give a quick shout out to all of our awesome patrons over at patreon.com/Emerald City Hockey, especially our Terror of the Deep patrons.
Thank you so much for making all this possible. We really appreciate your support.